Hey guys, today's lesson is 116. And if you want to go ahead and open your book to page 730, that's where I'll be starting. Today's lesson is about common denominators. Two or more fractions have common denominators if their denominators are equal. So 3/8 and 5/8 have common denominators because their denominators are the same. 3/8 and 5/9 do not have common denominators. The denominator is different. Just a reminder, the denominator is the bottom number. If you need help remembering it, I just think down denominator. So in this lesson, we're going to use common denominators to rename fractions whose denominators are not equal. So, example 1 says, rename 2/3 and 3/4 so that they have a common denominator of 12. This really ties in yesterday's lesson about renaming fractions. And this is, it's all building on itself, and you'll see where it all comes into even more practice later in the week. So again, example 1, rename 2/3 and 3/4 so they have a common denominator of 12. To rename a fraction, we multiply it by a fraction named for 1, meaning the numerator and denominator have to be the same because that would equal 1. So we want to change 2/3 and 3/4 to have the same denominator of 12. So let's think about it. 3 times what equals 12? Well, 3 times 4 equals 12. I can just write that in here to tell me that whatever I do at the bottom, I have to do up at the top as well. So I have to also multiply 2 times 4. So I already have the 12 here, so 2 times 4 is 8. So we have 8/12. 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Then I'm going to come over here and change 3/4 to be a fraction with a denominator of 12. So I have to multiply 4 times what to equal 12? Well, I know that 4 times 3 equals 12. So I multiplied 4 times 3 to get 12, so I have to do the same to the 3. 3 times 3. And we know that 3 times 3 equals 9. So my fractions are 8/12 and 9/12. Just a little tip, this will come in handy whenever you have to compare fractions. If you don't have the ability to draw them out, you just have to get them to have a common denominator, and then you can compare them. Let's look at example 2. Example 2 says, rename 1/2 and 1/3 so that they have a common denominator. This time, we need to find a common denominator before we can rename the fractions. The denominators are 2 and 3. The product of 2 and 3 is 6, so 6 is a common denominator. So we want our denominator to be 6. We have 1/2 and 1/3. So I do it the same way. 2 times what equals 6? Well, we just talked about how 2 times 3 equals 6, so I'm going to multiply 2 times 3. And that equals 6, so I have to do the same up here. 1 times 3 equals 3. So 1/2 is equal to 3/6. Now let's come over here to 1/3. What do I have to multiply the 3 by to get to 6? Well, we know from over here we multiply it by 2. 3 times 2 is 6, so I multiply this by 2 up here. 1 times 2 is 2. And there we go. We have 3/6 and 2/6. In examples 1 and 2, we found a common denominator of 2 fractions by multiplying the denominators. This method works for any 2 fractions. However, this method often produces a denominator larger than necessary. We can always do it to where we multiply the two denominators by each other. But sometimes that gives us fractions that are with denominators too big. For example, a common denominator for 1/2 and 3/8 is 16 because 2 times 8 is 16. But a lower common denominator is 8. We usually look for the least common denominator when we want to rename fractions with common denominators. And I think I mentioned least common denominator last week, but we'll go ahead and get to it. Example 3 says, write 1/3 and 1/6 with common denominators. A common denominator is the product of 3 and 6, which is 18. But we want to find the least common denominator, which is 6, because 1/6, it already has that denominator, and we know that we can multiply 3 to get to 6. So we only have to change one fraction in order to get to the least common denominator. So I keep 1/6 the same, and then I work with 1/3 to get to a denominator of 6. So 1/3 is equal to how many 6? Well, 3 times 2 is 6. So 1 times 2 is 2. So our two, if you want 1/3 and 1/6 to have common denominators, we can do 1/6, stay the same, and 2/6. And there we go. So again, you don't have to do the lesson practice. You do have to do the lesson practice. You don't have to do the independent work. So lesson practice is A through F on page 731. Just like yesterday, please, however you do the lesson practice, please take a picture of it and submit it in Schoology, and have maybe a parent just kind of watch as you're doing it to make sure you're understanding the concept. And that's all I have for you today. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know.